Seats again. We're going to start the next session. Our second Research Blitz is on social and public health initiatives. And I should sort of let you all take a peek behind the curtain for a second. When we get these research submissions, they come to us and then we sit down and start to figure out sort of what fits where and how these might fit together. And as you might imagine, it can be a little bit of a challenge conceptually and intellectually to kind of pull it all together. I really appreciate the framing that Harbir gave us for the first Research Blitz, thinking about glass half full versus glass half empty, and maybe some of the influences of things like technology, governance, regulatory regimes, and other factors that shape whether the situation is half full and half empty. I think that's probably a very useful framing for the next set of discussions that we're about to have on health and public health initiatives. And we are very, very fortunate to have Heather Schofield from the Perelman School of Medicine and the Wharton School of Behavioral Economist, with a tremendous amount of research experience in India to moderate the next session. Heather.
Well, I know that the interest is mainly in our panelists, so I'm going to keep things brief. My name is Heather Schofield. I do a lot of research on health and development economics in India, and I'm very thrilled to see the second Research Blitz on social and public health interventions because we have an amazing set of panelists. So I'm just going to jump right in and ask that Sharon Ravitch gets started. She's from the Graduate School of Education, and she'll be telling us about the Magic Bus program.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. A little bit closer, farther. It's good. I don't know. Oh, the clicker? Got it. Okay. So I have a clicker. I'm delighted to be here. Actually, for a number of years, I've come here to speak about the partnership between the Graduate School of Education here at Penn and the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. We're still in the fourth year of a 5-year memorandum of understanding in that work, and we work around CSR. We work directly with public serving enterprises through the CSR hub of the Tata Institute, which was a request of the government of India. And we work at the Center for Academic Leadership and Educational Management on leadership development. But I'm not talking about any of that today. I just wanted to, if there are any synergies that you think you might have with that project, I'd be delighted for you to reach out to me. I'm coming here today to speak about a project that I'm working on with Dr. Jerry Berman in the economics department. Jerry, if you want to just, yeah, there he is. Jerry and I actually, well, we met many, many years ago when he was doing work in Mexico and I was doing work in, or am doing work in Nicaragua. But 2 years ago here we met, and the fortuitous meeting ended up as a collaboration where I'm now doing an embedded qualitative study inside of a larger quantitative evaluation of the Magic Bus Foundation's adolescent sports program. So we are really delighted to be working with a number of colleagues from Fordham University on this project. And I am really honored to be a part of this team. And I'm just going to give you a very quick context on Magic Bus, and this is actually their slide. This comes right from their website, so I invite you to look. They do great work in a number of states and a few union territories. So basically, I'll just characterize, I'm not going to read the slide, but basically this is a program that uses sports as a conduit to both teaching a set of, teaching and assessing a set of cognitive development and cognitive skills, specifically the development of self-esteem, an aspirational sensibility, a satisfaction with life, which we all know is elusive, health and hygiene, and gender attitudes, right? So the goal of Magic Bus, again, is to use sports and athletics more broadly as a conduit for those things, and also they're beginning to think about gender integration through play. And so the quantitative study design is hardy, and it's been going on since they collected data in 2015. We are now we've designed this qualitative study. We looked as a broad team together at the quantitative instruments and the data that they generated. And so what we ended up focusing in after looking at those data is that the qualitative component is looking to understand the range and variation of mediating contexts, right? What are the influences on the conditions and constraints or possibilities for why and how families, the children of these families, are taking up or not taking up participation in the program in the villages that it has a really vibrant presence in. And then to think about very specifically the efficacy within each of these village contexts, and then to look horizontally across all of them at efficacy. But to use what we think of in qualitative research as the EMIC, insider village perspectives, as our heuristic for understanding efficacy, right? So not an external set of criteria that we're measuring against ad hoc, but we developed a set of criteria from talking with people in community, and now we're going to go in and be looking at, in relation to that, what are the stories that they're telling us about what mediates their take-up. And then also thinking about gender broadly in terms of how students and their children and their families are not only taking up, but engaging with the program, perhaps dropping out of the program. Are there differential take-up rates? What mediates, we know that there are, what mediates those? If and how gender, because we're looking at a static social class metric, right? So we're looking really at gender in the context of these rural, underserved villages, and we're thinking about how gender mediates the outcomes that we're seeing across students. So our qualitative collection is really looking very, very carefully at that. And then finally, really, we've used the qualitative piece to validate the metrics on the quantitative piece. So that's also been interesting. So I'll just spend a moment on this, and then I'll hand it off to...
Actually, very close out of time.
Oh, so I will just tell you this. We are now in early December going to be collecting data, and one of the things that we're most excited about is that we're using a local data collection company to collect data so that it's done in regional dialect rather than jumping over regional dialect to Hindi, where we think actually some of the data would really be compromised, the validity of the data. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Up next, we have Peter McNally, who's a visiting scholar at the School of Arts and Sciences.
So I'm going to be telling about some research that we've been doing in Tamil Nadu and Bihar on the social determinants of open defecation in various parts of India. The work is primarily supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So as about 5 years ago, there was, by various estimates, over 1 billion people who practiced open defecation around the world, and the majority of those people were in India. And it was a little bit of a puzzle as to why so much of that open defecation was found in India, given the amount of resources and income the individuals had in India compared to some other poorer countries which were making more progress. And some people were speculating that the socio-cultural context that India was in was was a large factor as to why it was lagging behind. Specifically, there might be norms of, say, purity and pollution that might be, prohibiting people from wanting to get a toilet, as well as caste-based factors as well. And so what we've done is, through a series of surveys, we've been testing for the existence of these norms, the degree to which they do indeed predict behavior, as well as mapping out social networks to see how people are connected to each other and how influence and information flows. Now, it's important to note that, in the context of this research, the government of India has been rolling out a really big campaign called the Swachh Bharat mission to eliminate open defecation by actually October 2nd of this year, which, as you know, just passed. They have declared the mission to be a success and said that, I'm guessing by people's reactions, they have some feelings on the matter. And some people are calling in to question whether that is a genuine success or not. We personally do not have any impact evaluation data to speak to that. However, we are rolling out an intervention in Tamil Nadu right now in the south of India, and our qualitative findings indicate that there is progress to be made. Now, what did we, well, we found a lot in this data, but I'll focus on the high-level findings. And one of the biggest patterns that emerged was that people's likelihood to own and use a toilet was very strongly predicted by their beliefs about what other people in their community did. So if someone thought that most members of their community owned and used a toilet, they themselves were likely to do the same as well. However, their behavior was not predicted, interestingly, by their beliefs about whether other people approved of toilet use. And so taking all of this together, we diagnosed toilet use as a descriptive norm in India, at least in the areas where we conducted this study. And that's important to know because that has strong implications for what kind of interventions would be appropriate. Specifically, if you're going to want to motivate toilet use and ownership, then you should try and convince people that people are owning and using toilets. And this finding was corroborated in several of our analyses. In addition to looking at norms, we also, again, we mapped out social networks, and we found that certain individuals were more influential than others. Specifically, close family members and friends had a stronger influence on one's likelihood to use a toilet compared to just regular neighbors who were not close ties, or members of the government who were the people who were pushing toilets. And we're going to be expanding this network analysis with a generous grant from the India Research Engagement Fund in what's called a sociocentric network analysis, where we're mapping out connections within an entire community to get a really comprehensive sense of how information is flowing. Now, again, we didn't want to just study what was going on. We wanted to see if we can actually make a tangible impact on behavior. And based off of this research, we're rolling out an intervention in Tamil Nadu with an NGO called Swasti, where we're going to be on an individual level and a household level, a group level, and an entire community level, trying to convey the idea that other people are indeed using, are committed to use, are owning toilets, and are maintaining their toilets. And we're doing this through personalized household visits, where we're sharing stories about what other people are doing and giving people goals and recommendations for activity. We're also taking advantage of existing social networks by getting people to send messages about use on their WhatsApp groups. We're also going to be doing community mobilization and commitment events where we're getting people to commit in a very visible group setting to using. Also putting up maps where you can see of a map of your community in these town panchayats. Where everyone is owning and using a toilet, and you can see how that's evolving over time. And also audio messages, which will be taken around these communities so that to reach some of the hard-to-reach people who are a little bit less connected. And overall, we're going to be trying to keep an eye towards whether this is indeed going to have an impact on behavior, and whether there might be some downstream effects. So some experimental research suggests that if you start to believe that people engage in a behavior, you infer that people approve of that, and we want to see if that's going to happen here as well. And we also want to see which sources of information are indeed the most influential. So if, are certain individuals more influential than others? Thanks.
Next up, we have Harsha Thirumoorthy, who is an associate professor at the School of Medicine, and he'll be telling us about indoor air pollution, also in Tamil Nadu.
Wonderful, thank you. So let me start by acknowledging support from the India Research Engagement Fund, which has made it possible for me. I'm an economist who's worked primarily on health in sub-Saharan Africa. So it made it possible for me to embark on this new collaboration and work on a new topic of household air pollution. And I'm going to keep us in Tamil Nadu and tell you about this new project. Let me start with some background on this topic. As many of you are aware, India has among the highest levels of air pollution globally, and this has important health consequences. So the Global Burden of Disease study in 2017 showed that nearly 1.2 million deaths in India just in 2017 alone are attributable to air pollution, and that accounts for about 12% of total deaths in India in that year. So fast-growing countries like India have to deal with the problem not just of ambient air pollution, which I think a lot of us are mindful of, but also household air pollution. The ambient air pollution is from industry, transportation, and sources of that type, whereas household air pollution is largely pollution that results from the use of solid fuels like firewood, charcoal for cooking. And nearly 56% of households in India, or 700 million individuals, are exposed to household air pollution. And you can see in this map that the proportion of households that are using solid fuels does vary in India quite a bit, but even in states like Tamil Nadu, we've got about 30% of households in rural areas using these solid fuels for cooking. And strikingly, I mean, when I entered working in this topic, I was struck by the fact that nearly 40% of the disease burden due to air pollution in India is actually from household air pollution. So if you go to a big Indian city, you're most mindful of the ambient air pollution, but really what's contributing to the disease burden in rural areas is the household air pollution. Interestingly, the economic development, economic growth in India has not solved this problem by itself. So it's not the case that as states have grown, that households are phasing out of solid fuels and moving to other types of fuels. And some have referred to this as this Indian chula trap, which is that despite growth and despite some improvement in this space, the number of households using solid fuels has stayed pretty stagnant. So the solutions vary from improved cook stoves, which we see a lot of in Africa, to gas and electric cooking. The Indian government has largely moved towards providing cleaner fuels, particularly liquefied petroleum gas, as the solution to this problem. That's been the leading approach in India, and it's one that continues to be a big part of countries' efforts to reduce household air pollution. And there's been a very prominent scheme, much like the one for open defecation, to make these LPG stoves available. So the PMUY scheme since 2016 has given out nearly 80 million stoves or connections to households. So where does this project come into this? We're focusing specifically on some of the behavioral challenges that the country continues to face. So despite the fact that households are able to obtain these LPG stoves, doesn't mean that month in and month out they're using the LPG cylinders that you need to have along with the stove. And there are a number of barriers to this, but one of the barriers in rural areas is indeed the price of LPG. Despite government subsidies, the out-of-pocket cost for many low-income households still is substantial enough that they resort to using firewood or continue to use firewood and charcoal. And importantly, even households that are starting to use LPG are still using the traditional fuels, and so you see this joint use of solid and LPG for cooking, which is what people refer to as stacking. So we're interested in moving households in this project from traditional fuel use to LPG use on an exclusive basis. And we're particularly interested in advising the government on subsidy levels that should be provided, particularly to low-income households. And this, I should say, is an important policy question that the government is interested in getting evidence on. So we feel the study is actually going to answer a question that is out there right now. There's a lot of discussion about rationalizing subsidies, which is to say, moving from a scenario where you have subsidies given to every consumer, even if they're high income, to doing it in a more efficient way so that the neediest households are the ones getting the largest subsidies. So we formed this new partnership. This is what I'll close on, is to tell you about the current state of this project, which is this new partnership with the Sri Ramachandra University in Chennai, which has an environmental health engineering department that is really the leading a source for household air pollution research and data in the country. They've done a lot of really path-breaking work on exposure to household air pollution and the relationship between exposure and health, but they haven't done so much on adoption and behavior related to LPG use. So the goal in our study is to understand what the demand for LPG among the low-income households that are eligible under the PMUY scheme, what is the demand for LPG in these households? We're also interested in knowing if you give highly subsidized LPG to these households for a short-term period, can you foster better habits in terms of using LPG in a sustained manner? So what we're doing is a randomized trial in rural Tamil Nadu, and the goal here is really to estimate in a very rigorous way how price-sensitive are households to LPG cylinders. These cylinders are what households have to buy every month, and we're trying to answer the question and advise the government, if you go from, say, a 25% subsidy, which is what they have in place right now, to a much larger subsidy like 50 or 75% in a targeted way, how much of an increase in LPG use will you see? Or will it be the case that households continue to use solid fuels because of price reasons or just a preference for using the traditional fuels? So the primary outcome in our study is going to be LPG use. We're working with distributors of LPG cylinders and monitoring how much LPG cylinders are actually being purchased at these varying prices. And we're also going to be using these stove use monitors to give us objective information on how much of the traditional stoves are being used and how much of the LPG stoves are being used. And we'll look at this over a long-term basis, even after the 3-month subsidy period is over, to understand whether LPG use can be increased over a long-term period with short-term subsidies. So I'll stop there and look forward to discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Professor Vinay Nakarni, and he's also at the Perelman School of Medicine, and he'll be telling us about active bleeding control.
Thank you. Well, it's really a great pleasure, and I also want to add my thanks for the Catalyst funding from IREF, but also more importantly for the impact and the coaching and the support from Amy and Allison and Tisha and others who really have facilitated more than the money. It's been bringing people together, using sort of the power of Penn and the name and the grant, if you will, to facilitate bringing us together to sort of address what's an important public health problem, stopping the bleed, mostly from road traffic accidents in India. And the active bleeding control, this is sort of an update. This is the sort of towards the end of our second year now of this program. And we reported sort of our fledgling introduction last year to empower bystanders to become trained, equipped, and help bleeding victims after road traffic accidents. And the pilot study was initially devised for a very active road traffic corridor outside of Hyderabad. And it was a collaboration of the GVK EMRI emergency medical system, which is like our 911, the 108 system in India, functions and covers about 550 million Indian lives for emergency medical systems. And a group called PediaStars, which trains using simulation training and has grown across the country, and an engineering group, General Aeronautics. And the reason is that one life is lost every 4 minutes in India due to a road traffic accident injury. About 40% of these, we discovered, were due to active bleeding that's uncontrolled, that bystanders are taking photos and arguing and discussing the accident and ignoring the bleeding victim, and that ambulances oftentimes in either rural or very urban communities with congested traffic take 20 to 30 minutes to arrive, while the rickshaw drivers and the police arrive within minutes, but were not trained or equipped to be able to deal with the initial management. So we underwent sort of a collaborative meeting to help devise and identify the hotspots in the community, and identified this road traffic corridor as very needy. We did field visits to the hospitals and to the auto rickshaw stands to sort of identify who was present and who could respond. We developed a simulation training program to help deliver the care and train people to act and how to stop the bleed. Very simple things like direct pressure, like putting a tourniquet on, things that are easily learned and don't require a lot of education. And then a data collection system using WhatsApp to be able to communicate amongst the trained providers, to activate them and also report the results. And this combined with a active campaign, a social media campaign, was able to sort of activate the community and recruit field workers and review what was going on. So last year we sort of reported on that initial program, and now we've started to add the delivery of these active bleeding control kits, a tourniquet, a hemostatic dressing, to the site using drones and using the EMS telephone operators to activate and deliver a drone to the site to a trained auto rickshaw driver who might be standing there and not have that capability. So in March 4th to 6th of 2019, we went and developed with this in-country counterpart the drones and started to pilot the training and the delivery in controlled sites in simulation. Our progress to date has really started to blossom. In the big scheme of things, it's a very small community that we've been training, but we now have 1,000 bystanders trained, and what we recognized was that we need to not just train them once, but we need to retrain them. So about a quarter of them, 225, now have been retrained, and there's a process of retraining them. These are police, auto rickshaw drivers, shopkeepers, toll plaza attendants, students, bus drivers, and conductors, all along this busy corridor. They have reported through their What's Up reporting system that 29 lives have been saved now just within this corridor from these bleeding events. And by survey, actually 162 have been supported, have been handled, yet they're so busy and they didn't quite know how to report. And so a number of those have sort of fallen through the cracks in terms of reporting. So the impact may be a little bit bigger than the 29 that we know of. There are regular road visits, and what we do is basically the rickshaw drivers have a tea break and they have little collections, and we've used those as our opportunities to do that. And then the newspapers in the local area have been happy to sort of report and publicize that. In the last 30 seconds or so, I just want to mention that the impact of this has been good, and we've learned quite a lot. There have been successes and many failures, but part of the success of this is that the spin-off projects that are starting to evolve from this collection of groups of technology-savvy media folks and the community members, we're starting now to work on development of new projects, a life box to use the drones to deliver organs for organ recovery between hospitals. And in fact, the trainers in this area have contacted the Indian Academy of Pediatrics, the Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine, and they now are forming an Indian Resuscitation Council that will be span India and start to use these programs as prototypes to start to disseminate throughout India. Thank you.
Wonderful. Our last presentation is by Yuchi Han, who's an associate professor at the Perelman School of Medicine as well, and she'll be telling us about cardiac care, cardiac MRIs in India.
So first, I also want to thank Amy and thank the Provost Fund for entirely supporting this project. So we are, I guess, looking at the utilization of advanced technology, which is the cardiac MRI. It has been, with increasing widespread use in the United States and in Europe, and multiple studies have shown that it changes patients' diagnosis in 60% and treatment in about 60% of cases. So it is a very influential and important technology that's gaining more utilization in the more developed world. But in terms of developing countries like India, there are at least two main barriers to this. One, first of all, is scanner availability. In the hospital that we collaborate with, probably seeing patients definitely more than us, but has one scanner. Versus here at University of Pennsylvania, we have probably over 20 scanners. So there's a big discrepancy in terms of access. Another main difficulty in India, in countries like India, same thing in China, is actually the providers, the trained radiologists and cardiologists who can actually provide the interpretation to the results, because even though they only have one scanner, it is a very standard scanner that we have here as well, which is equipped with all the sequences most of the sequences that we do, not so much the research sequences. So they're able to get very sufficient images in terms of diagnosing patients, but there isn't enough actually people who are trained to do that. Here in the United States and also in Europe, there's very standardized training programs for qualifications in terms of the operators who can do the interpretation. But in developing countries like India, like China, like pretty much everywhere else, they may, if they have resources, they may come to either US or Europe for a couple months of training. or they just kind of learn it on their job. So there's no standard in terms of training and interpretation. So what we wanted to do in this project is, actually we did it earlier this year in March, is to deliver a course. It's actually the first in its kind in the world to do an intensive training. So in 4 days, we discussed 100 cases of cardiac MRI to give basically those trainees a very good foundation to then go back and interpret perhaps another 50 cases to qualify for level 2 training equivalent in the US and in Europe. And this type of training allows the interpreter to actually interpret clinical images. So this was our experiment, and we collaborate with this institution, Sri Sathya Sai Institute of Higher Medical Education, which is a free hospital about an hour outside of Bangalore. And the person who does the cardiac MRI there is actually the president of India, the current president of the India Society of Cardiac Imaging. So we, together with a few of the also local people, local more advanced practitioners to conduct this course in 4 days. And they have a WhatsApp group that included all the trainees and local practitioners, about over 500 people. So this course was posted and was filled up. We had allowed 60 participants basically in 24 hours. And we had hands-on, which was also an important component of this, where they actually view the images, do their interpretations, do the post-processing, and come up with diagnosis with us there helping and guiding them. So the course was a great success, and our other agenda is actually to do research over there, specifically for the local diseases, because the rheumatic heart disease might be pretty prevalent here, 30, 40 years ago, but we rarely see those cases anymore. But it's still very prevalent in India. So we wanted it to, it's a valvular heart disease, and basically, as a result of untreated strep infections. And so that's one of the prevalent diseases there. The other is coronary artery disease, specifically in the younger population. They present maybe 10 to 20 years younger than the presentation here in the United States. So we wanted to acquire enough data over there to be able actually to look at some of the details of those diseases. And we want to be able to do this in I think that's the original title, is the ultra-fast way, because that's the other challenge, is that cardiac MRI takes longer time than usual, than if you are scanning for a knee or somewhere else. And time, or the scanner time, is precious. So we reduce that amount of time to about half, so they can do a study in 20 to 30 minutes rather than 45 to an hour that we take to do the study here. And there's, pretty much they streamline the process, and there's really not much compromise in terms of image quality. So let's see, the next slides just show you.
Just also, we're a little over time.
Great. So this is just a few pictures of the people there taking the class, and also us meeting the cardiology and radiologists together to do the research project, and then some patients waiting there. And the last one, I think, is just a few images that we obtained there. Definitely a great image quality. So thank you.
Well, thank you all. That was an impressive series of talks on a really diverse set of topics. I think, actually, if I could start off the questions, one of the themes that I really noticed across these talks was just the wide diversity and heterogeneity that is a part of working in India, and especially in healthcare in India. So there's heterogeneity across the people, about the delivery mechanisms. Is it public? Is it private? Acute versus chronic care. Could you each tell us a little bit about how that informs the type of work that you do, choosing any of those dimensions? How do you think through those issues given the challenge that it presents? And you can start at either end. No? So for example,
I can just start by saying it was clear from just sort of understanding the problem with the road traffic accidents that the first responders there were not medical, and so it was necessary to empower some other group to do it. Once given the permission, it was really great, but what they really wanted was the little badge that said I had been trained, and to put it in their rickshaw and, you know, sort of be able to brag about it. And when they actually encountered an accident and recognized that, yes, they were trained and, you know, they kind of knew what to do, but they really didn't, was when they sort of demanded retraining. And I think one of the ways that that was, that it's more successfully promulgated is through this What's Up kind of follow-up group, that going to a course or doing training or you know, finishing something, it isn't finished when you finish the course or the training, but that it's really that follow-up and the connection that they get with the individual that makes a big difference. And I think you were talking a lot about the influencers and, you know, how they learn and how they value what's going on around them. And so I think I got a much bigger appreciation of how important that was in actually making the program more successful.
interesting comment.
Yeah, so I mean, I think as the map I put up demonstrated, there's just wide variation in India when it comes to solid fuel use, and we want to be careful here in presenting the results, which I should say I hope to share with all of you next year at this event. But we want to be careful about not generalizing too much from the results. I mean, working more closely, I would say, with the Tamil Nadu government, because in India you have each state has its own scheme, and the chief minister may decide to have a scheme for subsidies for fuel or cooking gas. You know, it varies, and so we think there's value for the state, and it just given the size of the states, that's certainly a win in and of itself. But also, I would say, as an economist, I mean, if we see some price sensitivity in this study, you know, we have data now from so many parts of the world that show, in general, with lower prices, particularly for these lower income households, that can make a big difference. So it's not that the results don't apply to other states, but we want to be careful about exactly what the policy prescription is accordingly. Right. But it's a very valid point, and indeed one of the comments we got was, can you do something like this in the northern states where the burden of disease due to household air pollution is even greater? And indeed, that's part of our plan. But I think the relationship building is so key that we want to get started here before we expand. Yeah.
Do you want to keep commenting?
Sure, yeah. So one thing that, yeah, just kind of along those lines was that an emerging theme of research, at least on open defecation up until when we did the project, was the failure of just trying to apply a singular solution to, you know, a problem across a very incredibly diverse country where many problems were driving the behavior of defecating in the open, where many of these, so the Swachh Bharat mission isn't the first national sanitation campaign in India, not by any means. And many of the other campaigns were, at least people suggest, that they were not totally successful because all they were doing was focusing on getting people a toilet. And where there wasn't enough demand for a toilet to begin with, that people weren't necessarily using them, they weren't trying to facilitate the toilet getting there. And at least by kind of thinking about what people actually wanted and addressing that in a diverse way, not just like trying to use media, not just trying to use, so a common tool is called community-led total sanitation. That's just one of many tools that are being used right now. Yeah, thinking about what people actually wanted has shown more progress.
I would say, in the context of the study that I'm doing with Dr. Berman in economics, context is everything, and so precisely that has driven the need for this embedded qualitative study so that we can understand intragroup variability. What are the differences existing within a single place, let alone across places? And so, you know, as we think about perhaps depending on what we find in terms of outcomes, scaling up what Magic Bus is doing and improving upon it. We're thinking about that within the context of a customized replication model where we can look what are some horizontals that would be useful across communities, and then what are some of the really customized offerings that would need to be developed, and then who would be able to judge how to roll out that customized replication version of the overarching Magic Bus model.
Great. I'll open it now to questions from the floor. I think if you just raise your hand, we can get a mic to you.
On the issue of clean stoves, is there any discussion of replacing the fossil fuels with non-fossil fuels for the clean stoves?
Yeah, it's a good question, and certainly one that people have thought about here. So obviously with gas or electric cooking, you're not altogether avoiding the problem of air pollution. What people have remarked is that the contribution of cooking to the overall levels of air pollution is so small that it's not going to be the difference maker. So in other words, if you were to get rid of that altogether, it's by far not the most important driver. I'm not aware of efforts to use other types of technology. Now, obviously, like with solar energy, you can get around that issue if you've got households using stoves in homes where they have access to solar energy. But I think at this stage, the efforts have been so firmly rooted in the LPG expansion. But I'd love to hear other views on that.
Can I have a follow-up? The issue is deforestation in many of these areas, which causes the problem to be exacerbated, which is why I brought that up. So what you're saying is they don't have integrated thinking at the government level.
You're worried about the deforestation from the traditional fuel use? Oh, right. No, absolutely. So I think there's a concern about this being a problem not just because of the impacts on human health, but also the deforestation that can affect overall levels of air pollution in the region.
Adding on to this same topic, I happened to visit Mount Abu, where Brahma Kumari's organization is there, and also Tirupati. And both of those places, in Brahma Kumari's place, they produce 15,000 meals a day using solar energy. And in Tirupati, it is 30,000 meals a day using solar energy. So I think instead of pushing LNG or whatever, perhaps there should be some effort to build community kitchens that are powered by solar, and people can come and cook, and it'll make a very big difference.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the scope for those types of solutions is only growing, and there's a lot more interest in that. I totally agree. And what I'm not aware of is at the government level, in terms of their thinking on energy policy, particularly for household energy, how advanced are those efforts? I'm not aware of at the moment.
There's a lot that can be done. I can talk about it for hours.
That's great. That's great.
I think we have time for probably one or two more.
Peter, I'm curious about the extension of your work to other areas and other kind of behavioral norms. And have you guys thought about that as a group? Are you doing this research to kind of figure out a modality that could be applied in other areas, and if so, which ones? And I guess that I would kind of extend that question to everyone. The question that gets put to me all the time by the provost and others in College Hall is sort of, what is the next step? What is transformative with regard to this research? How do we as a university build on the individual research projects and the individual kind of disciplinary activities that are underway at Penn and create more interdisciplinary inquiries and initiatives that kind of are, potentially more transformative for the individual fields and the target areas and target questions. And so I would put that question to you because you're better prepared to answer it than I am.
So there's what's nice about the methods that were used in this particular study is that they can be applied to any different collective behavior, be it a norm, be it some other collective behavior like a custom. In fact, toilet use and open defecation was only one of the behaviors that we looked at in the study. We actually looked at 7 other behaviors that we thought might be at play in driving open defecation and toilet use. So various gender norms, various norms about how people spend money, and so on and so forth. And so, yes, this can definitely be expanded to a lot of other behaviors. So we're also doing work on using the same methods on child marriage, same methods on violence against children, same methods on a variety of behaviors. In terms of, but then kind of looking at this from another angle, what is potentially, there is some potential kind of high impact beyond this particular study. So let's say this intervention were to be proven successful. It does seem like there is a lot of work still to be done on sanitation, not only in India, but also in other countries too. So what's nice about this kind of design is that if you're able to show that changing people's beliefs about use is indeed effective, there's so many different ways you can do that. And you can scale this in a tremendously fast way through media, and kind of it's limited by your imagination. However, you obviously wouldn't want to just replicate it without doing any testing, because this was a unique case. Like we didn't expect to find a norm of toilet use in India. In fact, usually it's seen as a custom, which is another kind of collective behavior where people don't really care about others. So assuming you could prove that yes, there is a similar behavior elsewhere, you could take this and really kind of get to behavior change quickly.
All right, I think we can do one last question, and then we'll.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think, if you don't mind, he had his hand up first, I think, so we'll go with you.
Okay, this again is about Peter's study on factors that would increase the demand for toilets. It's not so much a question as a comment. When I used to work in India's villages 15, 20 years ago, when parents were looking for a groom for their girl, they would look for a boy who lives in a village where there's drinking water facility. Because if you marry your girl to a family that has no drinking water, you are condemning your daughter to lifelong drudgery. If in fact today, parents say we will not give our girl in marriage to a household that does not have a toilet, I think that'll change behavior, and that's what we should be looking for.
There actually was a campaign called the No Toilet, No Bride campaign, which was trying to do exactly that. Which it seemed like it did have a positive effect, but it had the potential side effect of making toilet use be seen as more of a gendered activity, where some people saw it as more of a feminine activity to use a toilet after the No Toilet, No Bride campaign. There isn't a ton of great data on that, but that does seem to be the narrative surrounding it.
All right, unfortunately, I think we are out of time, but if we could give one last hand to our amazing panelists. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
So the point you made just reminded me, this theory is